Welcome to the program. Now, Africa's debt burden continues to be an issue of concern, with the sub-Saharan region's total external debt stock standing at $702.4 billion in 2020 compared to $380.9 billion in 2012. This year alone, there were 22 African countries which were either in debt distress or standing on the precipice of one. These challenges come at a time when Africa, along with the rest of the world, is grappling with post-COVID-19 pandemic aftershocks, a financial crisis precipitated by the war in Ukraine, conflict and adverse weather conditions. The IMF has warned of economic collapse in African countries in coming years, with inflation on the rise, cost of living going up and higher interest rates, which will make it more expensive for them to borrow. Now, let's take a quick look at the state of debt on the African continent. First, 20% of the external debt owed by African governments is owed to China. At the same time, 17% of external interest repayments are made to China. As I mentioned earlier, China sits at the top of the list, followed by the United States, France, and Saudi Arabia. Rounding out the top 5 bilateral lenders is the United Kingdom. While China is Africa's biggest bilateral lender, 32% of African government external debt is owed to private lenders and 35% to multilateral institutions such as the World Bank. Furthermore, interest rates on private loans are almost double those on Chinese loans. According to British think tank Debt Justice, the average interest rate on private sector loans is 5% compared to 2.7% on loans from the Chinese public and private lenders. 12 of the 22 African countries with the highest debts are paying private lenders over 30% of their total external debt, while only 6 owe the same levels to China. These countries are Cape Verde, Chad, Egypt, Gabon, Ghana, Malawi, Morocco, Rwanda, Senegal, South Sudan, Tunisia, and Zambia. However, some of China's loans are mostly focused on infrastructure, have been criticized for their harsh terms and conditions. In the case of a loan to upgrade the Entebbe airport, the Ugandan government will have to give China the first 20 years of revenue to repay the debt. Now, what do institutions like the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund think of the debt situation on the continent? Namukabwe Runga is in New York and has more.
Debt in Africa is one of the topics that dominated speeches from African leaders who attended the 77th UN General Assembly here in New York. Rwanda's President Paul Kagame called for a seat for Africa in the G20, the forum that discusses issues that affect global economy. Zimbabwe's President Emerson Mnangagwa and Kenya's William Ruto called for pandemic-related debt relief for African countries, and especially those ones that have been adversely affected by the pandemic.
We're now joined by Richmond Frimpong, who is a financial analyst from Ghana. Thank you so much for your time and welcome to the program, Richmond.
Thank you.
So, is the IMF right to be alarmed about the debt situation on the continent?
The debt situation on the continent is getting worse and worse by the day. And it is right to be alarmed. Why? Because it has dire implications on the continent of Africa.
So, China is the continent's largest bilateral lender, but African countries owe more to other lenders, including private entities. So who are these entities and what does this mean for African economies?
Well, so it depends on the kind of debts that the economies of Africa are taking the funds from. There are multilateral agencies, for example, like the World Bank and the IMF. And then there are Western rich economies where the African countries take from specific countries that are able to lend. And then they are also able to go to the international markets. Now, on the international markets, they pick from pension companies, hedge funds, investment houses, and sometimes even individuals who are able to lend through the capital markets. And so it's a mix of multilateral agencies and then some financial institutions, some countries, and then the capital markets.
All right, Richmond, hold that thought because we're going to look at another aspect of this. Now, the debt to GDP ratio is yet another key aspect in looking at debt in Africa. Now, let's begin. Now, by definition, the debt to GDP ratio is a metric between a country's government debt and the size of its economy, also known as the GDP. Now, this ratio, which is expressed in percentages, is a measure of how strong a country's economy is and the likelihood of paying off its debts. A high debt to GDP ratio therefore means that a country is not producing enough to pay its debts. Now, the World Bank has established a threshold of 77%, beyond which lies an economic danger zone. Here now is a list of countries with the highest debt to GDP ratio according to latest IMF figures. Now, at number one, we have Sudan there with a percentage of 272%. This means that debt has surpassed the country's economy almost 3 times over. Now, at number two, we have Eritrea with 185%. The Horn of Africa country is among the nations in the region being ravaged by the worst drought in 40 years. Now, the Republic of Cape Verde, comes in third with 158%. Now, in June this year, the Cape Verde government declared a social and economic emergency as a result of drought, the aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the effects of the war in Ukraine. Now, next we have Angola. Angola is Africa's second largest oil producer and has a debt to GDP ratio of 136%. Now, it has now seen 5 consecutive years of recession, which was made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. Tied at number 5 are Southern Africa's Mozambique and Zambia with 128%. In September this year, Zambia secured a $1.3 billion loan to rebuild its economy after COVID-19 brought it to its knees. Its currency, the kwacha, is, however, the world's second best performing against the dollar. Mozambique was among 17 African countries whose interest-free debts were cancelled by China. Now, other countries on this list include the Democratic Republic of Congo with 101%, Tunisia with 89%, Zimbabwe with 86%, the Gambia with 83%, and Guinea-Bissau with 79%. Now, Richmond, you've looked at these numbers, you've seen what they mean, you've explained to them what they mean. Now, could you talk to us a bit about the debt to GDP ratio and what this means for African countries?
Right. So debt to GDP is one of the critical indicators any country uses to tell how strong and how well they are doing. The numbers you have just cited are quite distressing. And the reason why they are distressing is that when your debt to GDP increases against what you are making in total for your GDP, then it basically means you are not able to pay your debts. And we categorize you as high distress debt country. Now, when that happens, it means almost every money you raise or revenue you raise, you use it all entirely to pay your debts. Sometimes even the interest, not the whole principal itself. And it becomes troubling because then you exchange that for development. You exchange that for progress for the economy. And so whenever you see that an African country is spiking in its debt to GDP, then the risk of development is high. And when that happens, poverty increases by the day.
Now, the World Bank has given the threshold as 77%. So what does this mean when we see countries with percentages of up to 200%? What does that mean for those particular countries?
What it means is that, number one, they are not able to pay the debt they owe. And number two, they don't have the fiscal space to use their own funds to project development or to support development.
All right. Now, debt is not just confined to Africa. Like, for example, Japan's debt to GDP ratio is almost, Japan's debt, for instance, is almost double its GDP, but it's still one of the world's strongest economies. So how is this possible, and what do African countries have to learn from this?
It's very simple. 2 things. Yes, Japan may be high in terms of their debt to GDP, but again, check their tax to GDP. They are doing very well, in excess of 34% of their total GDP. So we cannot compare ourselves to a country like Japan in terms of their debt to GDP when our tax to GDP or our total revenue to GDP is way below. Averagely, Africa is doing about 13% revenue to GDP as against over 80 and now more than 100% of debt to GDP. So we are taking so much debt, paying so much for the debt, but receiving very little to cure or to match the debt we are having. So if we want to be like Japan, then we should not just look at debt to GDP. We should look at our tax to GDP, our total revenue to GDP.
All right. So hold that thought, Richmond. We'll talk more in just a moment. Now, from the year 2000 to the year 2018, African governments and state-owned enterprises have been loaned a total of $148 billion by China. Being the world's second largest economy, China has become the biggest trade partner for African countries. Now, since 2010, the Chinese financial institutions have funded an average of 70 projects a year in Africa with an average value of $180 million. Mel Miendo takes an in-depth look at China's relationship with Africa.
China presently is a leading bilateral lender in 32 African countries and the top lender to the continent as a whole. In mid-2021, the Chinese Loans to Africa, CLA database by the China-Africa Research Initiative, showed that from 2000 to 2019, Chinese financiers signed 1,141 loan commitments with African governments. China's financing has been focused on countries rich in minerals and hydrocarbon. These include Zambia, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Angola, Mozambique, Sudan, South Africa and Tanzania, and in North Africa, Algeria and Egypt. Data from the Center for Global Development shows that between 2007 and 2020, China invested about $23 billion on infrastructure projects in the continent. Here in Kenya, which is where I am, is the standard gauge railway passing right behind me from Mombasa to Nairobi. It is one of Kenya's largest infrastructure projects, which is estimated to have cost $3.2 billion. In Ethiopia, China has funded the Addis Ababa Light Rail Transit and Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway, Lobetu-Luau Railway in Angola, and in 2017, the ongoing construction of a hydropower plant worth $3.83 billion. In Nigeria, the Abuja-Kaduna Railway, which was also funded by China, as well as the construction of an oil refinery in Edo State at a cost of $1.7 billion. The $170 million African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, was fully funded and built by China. Similarly, in 2018, the West African Regional Bloc, ECOWAS, signed a deal with China to build their headquarters in Abuja at a cost of $31.6 million. In 2017, Ghana agreed to an $8.5 million bauxite exploration deal with the government of China. China is also investing in DRC's special economic zone being built in Point Noir in what China calls a direct investment and not a loan. In Zambia, China is responsible for a number of projects, including a 750-megawatt hydropower project, 2 of the state-of-the-art international airports, and the flagship project of the railway line connecting Zambia to Tanzania. In Egypt, a Shanghai-listed developer invested up to $17 billion to build an upmarket cosmopolitan area in Egypt's new city. And just before his ouster, China had presented a $1 million gift to former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. The gift was a new parliament building donated from the Chinese government at an estimated cost of $118.7 million.
You know, apart from Chinese lending, how else can Africa meet its financing needs, especially for development projects?
Number one, Africa should know that we cannot become prosperous through debt. Debt is a great challenge to prosperity. And so to be able to cure the problem of going for these high ticket, very expensive debt instruments, one of the things Africa is missing is our ability to generate a lot of revenue through trade. Not trade even with the world per se, but trade with Africa itself. I mean, Africa has one of the largest economies in the world, but we don't trade with ourselves as much as we trade with the East, the West, among others. And so first, let us leverage on this continental free trade platform Africa has created. Number two, we must move away from the basic economic structure of depending on raw materials or resource-backed natural resources. Natural resources like cocoa, gold, diamond, and the like do not generate for us enough. So we must now move into industrialization and be able to bring a lot of value into the basic resources we generate. And then we are able to compete in terms of revenue on the global market with these valued added products. And that way, we are able to hold the fort of our foreign exchanges. We are able to hold the fort of our fiscal deficit. We are able to hold the fort of inflation and the other macroeconomic indicators so that we can turn around our economies.
Finally, just to wrap this up, do you think Africa will ever be fully able to pay off its debt?
I mean, that is a very good question to ask, but the ability to be able to pay or not to pay is actually in the hands of Africa. The nature of the debt Africa is currently hanged with now is difficult to pay if we go at the pace we are going now. We are likely not to be able to pay if we don't change. And two things we can change. Number one is to transform our economies from just the basic resource base to a value-added based economy. Number two is to improve trade amongst ourselves so that our revenue to GDP would be able to take care of our debt to GDP. So we don't need to go out and borrow these very high net ranking debt instruments we buy. If we're able to do these two things, then yes, there is a way out for Africa.
All right, Richmond, thank you so much for those insights. Very useful indeed.
Thank you.
Now, we take a break, but when we return, we take a look at just how much African leaders earn and how this compares with their counterparts from around the world. Don't go too far.